Welcome to this WiseOwl Excel VBA tutorial. This is the first part of a series which explains how to write SQL code to work with Excel files. And in this first video, we're going to look at how to retrieve data by writing basic select statements. We're going to begin with a quick review of the code that I've already written to connect to an Excel file. This relies heavily on Microsoft ActiveX data objects, which isn't really the focus of this particular series. Here we want to focus on the basic SQL queries, but it's still useful to get a quick overview of how the ActiveX data objects code works. Once we've done that, we're going to look at how we can get all of the columns from a range of different things in an Excel workbook. So that includes a worksheet, a specific range of cells using cell references, and named ranges of cells. Once we've done that, we'll look at how we can write basic SQL select statements and how we can use that to refer to a specific set of columns that we want to return. We'll also look at how to return specific columns when the worksheet or the range of cells you're referencing doesn't actually contain any column headers. We'll look at how you can rename both columns and tables by assigning aliases to them. And for the final part of the video, we'll talk briefly about how you can lay out your query code a little bit more neatly to make your queries easier to read when it's written into the Visual Basic Editor. So let's get started. Let's start with a quick look at the basic setup for the video. I've created a workbook that allows us to run a query to return information from a separate Excel file. At the moment, clicking the Run Query button basically tells you you haven't written a query yet. But once we have done that, we'll be connecting to this separate workbook called Movies, which contains a bunch of different worksheets and tables of data containing lots of information about various different films, and that will all be returned into a separate worksheet in the Basic Select Statements file. Both of those files are stored in the same folder, and I'll stick a link in the video description so that you can download these files yourself and follow along and write the code if you'd like to. The code that I've already written in the Basic Select Statements workbook relies heavily on Microsoft ActiveX data objects. Now, I'm not going to talk about that topic in this series much. This series is meant to focus on the SQL side of things. So just in case you're not familiar with ActiveX data objects and how to connect to Excel files and return data, we have a whole set of other videos which explains how to do that. If you're just getting started, I'd recommend this video, How Do I Get Data from a Closed Excel File Using VBA? Just to give you the broad strokes of the code so you understand the basics of what's happening, if I head into the Visual Basic Editor, I've already set a reference to the Microsoft ActiveX Data Objects library, so just to show you that in the Tools References dialog box. So the basic code that gets triggered when you click on the Run Query button is this one here, and this is where we're going to write our SQL query. This is pretty much, apart from a couple of minor exceptions, the only line of code that we're going to change in this entire video. When we've written our query, that's going to get passed into this Get Query Results subroutine, and this is the one which establishes the connection to the separate Movies workbook with the connection string property here. Our query gets used to set the source property of a record set, and then I've written a bunch of extra code to generate a new worksheet, write the contents of the record set out into that worksheet, do all the formatting to tidy up the column headers and the column widths, etc. And I've even gone to the extremes of adding some error handling code as well, so I've been a lot less lazy than I usually am in these videos. I'm sure you can still break this code, by the way, if you were really determined, but it's robust enough for the basic things we're going to do in this video. For the first example query, I'd like to return all of the results from one single worksheet in the Movies workbook. The worksheet I'm going to go for is called Film, and this contains 14 columns and 1200 rows of data. So I'd like to return all of that into a new worksheet in the Basic Select Statements workbook. To do this, all I really need to know is the name of the worksheet that contains all of the information. If I write this in a particular way in my query, that will return everything from that sheet. So in the Visual Basic Editor, find the line which says SQL query equals an empty string, and then simply inside those double quote characters there, open and close some square brackets, and then type in the name of the worksheet followed by a $sign to indicate that it's a sheet object. Having done that, if I switch back to the menu worksheet in this workbook, I can click my Run Query button, and that will return everything from the film sheet in Movies. So just to check, I've got the 14 columns and the 1200 rows as well. Now I've run my query while the Movies workbook is still open, but of course one of the benefits of using ActiveX data objects is that you can retrieve data from a closed workbook. In fact, that's pretty much the point. So just to demonstrate this, I'm going to head to the Movies workbook and I'm going to close that down. And then if I go back to my menu sheet and click the Run Query button again, I'll return all of the same data from the Movies workbook, even though it's closed. Now I'm going to want to keep the Movies workbook open just to make it convenient to point out the various ranges of cells we're going to refer to and select from. So let's head back to that folder and reopen the Movies workbook. And then I'm going to go back to my menu worksheet in the Basic Select Statements workbook and click the Delete All But menu sheet just to tidy up my workbook. Using the name of the worksheet to return all the data contained within it is nice and convenient, providing your worksheet contains only that one table of data. But if the structure of your worksheet is a little more complex than that, say for example like the Film Years worksheet in this Movies workbook, we've got multiple separate tables listed here. We've got some extra header rows as well that describes the name of the table. So if we try to pass in Film Years as the name of our worksheet, our results aren't quite as neat and tidy as they were previously. So let's say SQL query equals Film Years followed by a $. Head back to the menu sheet and click the Run Query button. So here you can see we've gotten some obscure column headings, we've got some generic column headings F2, F3, F4, etc. And we've got the column headers for the separate tables listed out multiple times, so it's not quite as neat as it could be. I'd like to be able to refer to just a single table of data in that particular worksheet. So what we're going to do now is extend this by adding on the cell references. So let's have a look at the set of cell references we want to get. I want to get everything from cell A2 down to D12 to just get the table of 2020 highest grossing films. So to do that, back in the Visual Basic editor, still inside the set of brackets, but after the $sign which indicates the sheet name, I can type in cell references like A2 colon D12. So having done that, I can head back to my menu sheet, click the Run Query button again, and this time I'll get just the data from that specific range of cells that I've asked for. As well as using cell references to refer to a specific block of cells, you can also use range names in Excel. Switching back to the Movies workbook, if I want to see a list of all the range names I have access to, I can click on the drop-down arrow in the top left-hand corner of the worksheet to show the list of range names that I've currently created. Selecting a range name from the list will highlight the appropriate block of cells in the relevant worksheet. So I've got 4 separate range names on the Film Years sheet, and I've also got a range name called Movie Table, which refers to the full table of films on the Film worksheet. For this particular example, let's get all the films from the 2019 table. So I can simply copy that range name from the drop-down list there, head back to the Visual Basic editor. With this particular range name, I don't need to reference the worksheet that it belongs to. I can replace the entire contents of those square brackets there with just the name of the range. I don't need the $sign at the end because I'm not referencing a worksheet, it's a named range. So if I switch back to the menu sheet and click my Run Query button again, I get a new table of results in a separate worksheet consisting of everything from the film's 2019 range from that worksheet. You can create your own range names in Excel fairly easily. Just in case you haven't done this yourself before, it might be worthwhile just very quickly showing you that if I switch to the film sheet, I could highlight a particular block of cells. Let's say we'll go with the first 10 films in the list and the first 5 columns there. And one way to create a range name fairly simply is to click into the name box and type in a new name for that block of cells. I'm going to call this one Top 10 Films. There are several rules that you must follow when you're naming ranges. You can't use spaces, for example. Many punctuation characters are disallowed. You can't use reserved words like the names of functions or things which look like cell references. So it's best to stick with just combinations of text and numbers like this one here. And to create the range name, I can press Enter, and that's now added to my workbook. Just to prove that it exists, we can click into a different cell in this worksheet or even a different worksheet altogether. And if we go back to the drop-down list and choose the top 10 films range, that will select that block of cells. So I'm going to save this Movies workbook, and then I'm going to copy that range name to my clipboard, head back to the Visual Basic editor, exchange Films 2019 for top 10 films, back to the menu sheet, and then click the Run Query button again, and I return all of the information from the new range name I've just created. I think it's probably about time just to tidy up that worksheet at this point, or this workbook, so I'll head back to Menu and choose Delete All but Menu Sheet. Up to this point, we've always used a set of square brackets to enclose the name of the worksheet or the range name that we're selecting our data from. But the square brackets aren't always necessary. Square brackets are used to enclose identifiers, or the names of things, in SQL. You only really need the square brackets around your identifier if the identifier contains a space or other unusual punctuation character. So because range names can't contain those sorts of characters, you can happily omit the square brackets from around the range name, and then if I switch back to the menu sheet and run the query again, it will happily return all the data without using the square brackets. That's not quite so successful if you try to reference a sheet name, however, because the sheet name has to end in a $. If I go back to the film sheet, if I try to run this query with the menu sheet run query button, that will fail with an error in the the SQL statement. So in order to make this one work, we have to set the square brackets around the identifier. And having done that, when I run the query again, it works again quite happily. The best policy, because it's far less likely to fail if you always use the square brackets, just always put them in even if you don't think you're going to need them. Just one final note on using range names. It's possible to have range names in a workbook that are scoped either to the entire workbook or to a single worksheet. We've got some examples of both types in our movies workbook. If I'm on, say, the film sheet and I click on the drop-down list there, I can see a list of all of the workbook scoped range names. If I switch over to the Film Years 2 worksheet, if I click on the drop-down arrow now, I can see some extra range names that didn't previously appear. So all the ones with the name local at the end of them all refer to a specific range of cells on this single specific worksheet. So if I select 2019 Films 2019 Local, it selects that block of cells on that sheet. Another way to see the scope of range names in your workbook is to use the Formulas tab in the ribbon and the Name Manager tool. If I open the Name Manager, you can see in this dialog box it tells you the scope for each range name with the scope column. If I wanted to reference one of these locally scoped range names, I need to make sure I precede it with the name of the worksheet to which it belongs. So I'm just going to copy the Films 2019 local range name to the clipboard, and that belongs to a worksheet called Film Years 2. So if I head back to the Visual Basic Editor, if I just extend this to say Film Years 2, I can then paste in the name of that range name, Films 2019 Local, and if I switch back to the Excel workbook, head to the menu sheet, click the Run Query button, it will happily retrieve all of that data. If I switch back to the Visual Basic Editor and I take away the name of the worksheet to which that range name belongs, so this would work if it was a globally scoped range name or a workbook scoped range name, but because this is specific to a single worksheet, if I run the query, that fails with an error message. So far, all of the ranges of cells and worksheets we've referenced have a top row containing column headers. But what if we wanted to refer to a block of cells or a worksheet which doesn't contain column headers, like this worksheet called Film No Headers? Let's try to do that. I'll head back to the Visual Basic Editor and I'll change my query to say Film No Headers, and because that's a worksheet name I need to finish that with a $ symbol. Now at the moment, my connection string in the Get Query Results subroutine indicates that the range of cells we're going to refer to does indeed contain a header row. It has an extended property called HDR, and that's set to be equal to yes. So at the moment, the block of code that's going to loop through the column headers a little bit further down here, somewhere in here, there we go. So this little for next loop loops through the column headers or the field names of the record set. So that's going to mean if I head back to the menu sheet and I run this query, it's going to take the first row of data from that Film No Headers worksheet, and it's going to translate that into a set of column headers, which looks a little bit strange. So let's just change that property in the connection string. If I head back to the Visual Basic Editor, in the connection string property, we'll find the HDR extended property and set that to be no. So if I run the query again from the menu sheet, this time it will treat the first row of data as an actual row of data, and it will create some generic column headings labelled F1, F2, etc. The F stands for field, of course, so field 1, field 2. Now, just because most of the rest of the code we're going to write here is going to rely on the column headers in our worksheets and ranges of cells, I'm going to switch back to the Visual Basic Editor, and I'm going to change the extended property HDR back to yes. And then I'm going to change the worksheet we're selecting from to say film $. So once again, if I go back to the menu sheet and click the Run Query button, I'll find I get my column headers written in neatly again, and I think it's probably time for another quick tidy up by deleting everything but the menu sheet. So far we've managed to return quite a lot of data just by referencing a worksheet name or a range name or a block of cells on a worksheet. So we haven't technically written an SQL query yet at all. One of the downsides to the style we've used so far is that we always get every single column on the sheet or range that we reference. What if we wanted to narrow down the list of columns and only pick the things we were interested in when we run the query? In order to do that, we need to learn how to write an SQL select statement. Just to give you a brief look at the basic outline of a select statement, there are 6 main keywords that we'll build up to throughout the course of this particular playlist. We're just going to focus first of all on the select and the from clauses. So we'll ignore the where, group by, having and order by. We'll bring those back in later videos. We're just going to look at the select list to pick a specific list of columns, and the from clause, which is where we reference the tables. Tables, when you're referencing an Excel workbook, are the sheet names, the range names, and the cell references. So basically exactly what we've been doing up to this point so far. The first example I'd like to create is going to return the same set of results that we're currently returning with this basic query, which is just the name of the film worksheet. To convert that into a proper select statement, just before the name of the worksheet, I'm going to type in the word select. It doesn't matter whether you write the word select in capital letters or lowercase letters, it's not case sensitive. I then want to specify that I want to return all of the columns from that table. So I can type in an asterisk symbol to represent all of the columns, followed by the word from, again in uppercase or lowercase or a mix of the two if you prefer, it really doesn't matter, and then the name of the table or the worksheet that I'm selecting that data from. So as I say, this will do nothing more than what we've already done just by referencing the worksheet name, but just to demonstrate that it does work, back in the menu sheet, if we click Run Query, we return all of the columns from the film worksheet. Just to demonstrate that we can still use all of the other techniques we've looked at so far, let's just modify the from clause to select from a specific range of cells on that worksheet. So film $, and then I can say A1 colon, let's say E11. And then if I go back to my menu sheet and I run the query, that will return the top 10 list of films. If I head back to the Visual Basic Editor and I change this to a range name, let's call this one, let's go for Films 2018. If I head back to the menu sheet and run that one again, that will still work. And we can also scope that to, or refer to, a locally scoped range name as well. Let's go for one on the Film Years 2 worksheet. Let's go for the 2017 local one this time. So I'll just copy that name to the clipboard. And then Film Years 2 is the name of the worksheet. So I'll say Film Years 2. And then follow that with a $, and then paste in the name of the locally scoped range name, Films 2017 local. And if I go back to the menu sheet again and run that query, that one works as well. So basically the same things we've done by referring to a worksheet, range name or block of cells, you can place in the from clause of your select statement. Time for a quick tidy up. I'm going to go back to the menu sheet and delete all but menu sheet. And then back in the Visual Basic Editor, I'm going to take this query back to selecting everything from the film worksheet. The point of writing our query as a proper select statement was so that we could get some more control over exactly which columns we return. So let's say we wanted to pick just one single column from the film sheet. We'll need to know what those column names are, so let's head back to the Movies workbook, head to the film sheet, and we'll begin by selecting just the title column. So we know its name, it's called title. We can head back to the Visual Basic Editor and we can replace the asterisk with the name of that column. Now that's an identifier, so it's the name of something in SQL. Because it doesn't contain any spaces or any unusual punctuation characters, we don't need the square brackets wrapped around its name. If we head back to the menu sheet and we run this query, we'll see that we return just that one single column. If I move on and I wanted to select another column from the same table, let's go for the runtime column next. That column name has got a space in its name. So if I head back to the Visual Basic Editor, to add a second column to the select list, what I have to do is type in a comma and then type in the next column name. Now this one isn't going to work if I try to run this query because the second column name has a space in it. When I run the query, it returns an error. So to make sure that that identifier is recognized as a single thing, a single entity, a single name, we can wrap that in some square brackets. And just for consistency, even though I know that I don't need to, I'm going to put square brackets around the title column as well. And if we head back to the menu sheet, run the query again, now that returns the runtime column too. I'll just add in a couple of extra columns. I'd like to get the release date and also the Oscar wins column from right at the very end. So let's add in those extra 2 columns as well, back in the Visual Basic Editor. Each new column that I add needs a comma. The space there is optional. I don't technically need a space after the comma, but I find it easier to read with a space. So it's entirely your choice. Blank space, white space is pretty much ignored by SQL, so you can have as many spaces between things as you like, providing that's not the column name, so I couldn't enter multiple spaces here. So the next column name is release date, and then the final column name was Oscar wins. And having added all of those columns in, I'll just give my query one quick extra test from the menu sheet, run the query, and I get the list of all of the columns that I've asked for. So this technique is great providing that the worksheet or the range of cells you're referencing actually contains column headers. If not, then we've got a little bit more work to do. Let's say we wanted to return the same set of columns from the film no headers sheet. To make that work, I'm going to head back to the Visual Basic Editor and I'm just going to make a copy of my SQL query line and then paste that in just below. I'll comment out one of those 2 lines then, and I'll change my table name from film to film no headers. I'm also just going to temporarily switch the HDR extended property of my connection string to no, just to make sure that that is set and works properly as well. So it will be no great surprise that if we try to reference these column names when they don't exist in that worksheet, if we go back to the menu sheet and hit the Run Query button, that will fail miserably. Rather than referencing columns by name, we can reference the fields based on their position. So if I wanted to refer to the title field, that's the second column in that table or in that worksheet, the runtime is the 4th column, release date is the 3rd column, and Oscar wins is the 14th column. So let's head back to the Visual Basic Editor. I can change title to say F2. I can change runtime to say F4, release date to say F3, and Oscar wins to say F14. So I didn't point this out earlier on, but you can tell from this that it's possible to select your columns in a different order to the one in which they're listed on the actual worksheet. So we're going from the 2nd, 4th, 3rd and 14th columns. Having done that, I can head back to the menu sheet, click the Run Query button again, and this time we'll get that list of columns in the same order, but without the existing column names. It would be nice to provide column names for the output sheet, even though the original source data doesn't contain those column headers. And we can do that by assigning an alias to each field that we select. So let's say we wanted to call these title, minutes, release date, and Oscar wins. To do that, back in the Visual Basic Editor, after I've referred to the field name before the comma that defines the next column, I'm going to type in the word as, followed by the name that I'd like to assign to this column for this query. So if I wanted it to be called title, I can type in the word title like so. An alias is another identifier, so although I don't need to wrap this up in square brackets because it has no spaces or unusual punctuation characters, for consistency I'd put some square brackets around it. I can rename column F4 or field 4 as, I think I said I'd call that minutes, and then F3 is the release date. So this alias does need square brackets because it contains a space. I'll say release date. And then likewise, F14 will also need a set of square brackets because the alias I'm going to use, Oscar wins, contains a space. So having done that, I can head back to the menu sheet, click my Run Query button again, and this time I'll get the data from the original No Headers worksheet, but provide headers in the final output. You can also use column aliases to replace existing column names. Let's head back to the Visual Basic Editor. I'm just going to scroll down and update my HDR property to say yes. And then I'm going to comment out the second SQL query line and replace that with the original one, selecting from the film sheet. I can rename any of the columns I like. Let's say I wanted to rename the title column as film name. I might also want to replace the runtime field with the name length. So I can say as length. And then I'll leave the release date and Oscar wins as they are. So you don't need to alias every single column. Having done that, I can switch back to my menu sheet, click the Run Query button, and I've got the data from a sheet which has existing column headers, but they've been replaced in my final output. Time for a quick tidy up. I think I'm going to go back to the menu sheet, delete everything but the menu sheet, and then back in the VB editor, I'm just going to delete the commented out query that selects from the worksheet with no headers. As well as using an alias to replace the name of a column, you can do the same thing to replace the name of a table or worksheet, range name, block of cells, whatever you've referenced in the from clause. There isn't a huge deal of point in doing this in this particular example, simply because we're only selecting from one single sheet here. But in later videos in this series, we're going to be selecting from multiple sheets and ranges at the same time. And it's possible that in those sheets and ranges, we can have the same column name appearing multiple times. In that case, it will be important to distinguish between the different ranges that we're selecting from to specify exactly which column we're referring to. Currently, the way we would have to do that is to precede each column name with the name of the table or worksheet or range name or whatever. So I could copy that film $ in square brackets, and then in front of each column name, I could paste that in, followed by a full stop to separate the table name from the column name. So it's a little bit like in Visual Basic or VBA. You can refer to a property of an object. You can think of the column as a property of the table object. So I can do that in front of every single one of these columns. It's going to make the query quite long at this point. So in front of each existing column name, I can put in film dot. So having done that, the query will still work in exactly the same way. If I head back to the menu sheet, I can run my query and return all the same results. The column name doesn't appear, the table name doesn't appear in front of the column name in the final output. You can see that that's made our query quite long-winded at this point, and the longer a table name or range name you're referring to, the longer the query becomes. So it's convenient to be able to replace the long table names with a quick nickname for this particular query. And we can do that in the same way we assigned the column aliases. After the table name, we can say as. I tend to give my table aliases very short names, usually just the first letter of the name of the table, so F for the film table. If there are multiple tables with the same first initial, I might call them F1, etc. Now, because it's just a single letter, it's highly unlikely I'm going to use an unusual illegal character like a punctuation character or a space, but just for consistency, I'm going to wrap up that new identifier in a set of square brackets as well. Then, heading back to the beginning of my select list, I can replace every name film $ with the letter F instead. So it's still a fairly long-winded query at this point, and it's entirely unnecessary for what we're doing in this particular video, but just setting us up for some information we will need to use later on in this series. If I head back to my menu sheet one more time, click the Run Query button, I'll get once again exactly the same results. For the final section of the video, I just want to talk a little bit about how we can improve on our query layout. When queries get a bit longer like this one, it can be quite difficult to read the entire thing in one go, particularly when it spills off the edge of the page. Fortunately, in VBA terms, our query is just a string of text, and if you know anything about manipulating strings in VBA, you'll know that we can split that string into as many separate parts as we like, concatenate it all back together again, and as long as the concatenated final version makes sense as a query, it will still work. But it will be a lot easier for us to read. So as a bare minimum, what you might consider doing is splitting the select list onto a separate line and the from clause onto a separate line. Let's start by breaking this line itself up into two separate parts. So I'm going to type in a space and an underscore after the equal sign, and then take the beginning of my select statement down one line, and then press the tab key to have that indented. What I then want to do is break my string immediately after the last column that I've referenced before my from clause. Now I need to include a space, or I should include a space, between the end of the select list and the beginning of the from clause. Where I put that space is entirely up to me. I could leave it at the end of the first line, or I could include it at the beginning of the next. I could even include two spaces, one at the end of the first line and one at the beginning of the next. Multiple space characters don't really matter to SQL. I'm just going to leave my space character at the end of the first line. So I'm going to close my double quotes there and then concatenate that with a space and an underscore, and then take the from clause down to the next line and open up some more double quotes. So when that line gets put together, it still reads in the same way as a query. It's just a little easier for us to read as a human being. We can see the select list on one line and the from clause on the next. If we head back to the menu sheet, we can run the query again, and it still gives us exactly the same end results. Once you've done that, you might consider taking things a step further by separating out the select keyword and the from keyword onto their own separate lines, a little like the outline of the select statement I showed you earlier on, where the main keywords occupy their own separate lines. So to do that, once again, we can simply break our string of text up into more parts. So after the select keyword and after the space, I'm going to close a set of double quotes and then concatenate that with a space and an underscore. And at the beginning of the next line, I'm going to hit the tab key to indent that line by one tab space and then open up some double quotes. The end of that line is concatenated already with the from clause. And again, after the from keyword, after the space, I'll close the double quotes, type in a space, ampersand, space, underscore, take the table name and its alias down to the next line, hit the tab key, and then open up some more double quotes. Now, once again, there's no difference when all of that string is put together again. It still forms the exact same query. So heading back to the menu sheet and clicking our Run Query button once again returns exactly the same end results. Once you've gone this far, you may consider taking things even a step further and putting each column in the select list on its own separate line. This is going to lead to a fairly contentious topic shortly, as I'll explain, but just for now, let's separate each column onto a separate line in our code. I'm going to click just after the first column name and alias. The space I put in after the comma before the next column name was for readability purposes. It doesn't need to be there. And as these are going to be on separate lines now, I'm going to get rid of that extra space, close the double quotes after that comma, and then type in an ampersand, space, underscore, and take the next column down to the next line. I can then open some double quotes, find the next comma, get rid of the space after it, close the double quotes, ampersand, space, underscore, open some more brackets at the start of the next line, get rid of the extra space after the comma, close the double quotes, and then concatenate that with another new line with an open double quotes character there. So that makes things a lot neater, I think a lot easier to read vertically at least. We don't have to read the entire list of column names on one single gigantic line. Appreciate it takes a little bit more effort to get that to work with the extra concatenation symbols, but ultimately the end result when we head back to the menu sheet and we click the Run Query button is that importantly we get the results from the query that we were interested in. Now I mentioned that there was a contentious issue when you start writing your column names on separate lines in your SQL queries. And the source of the controversy is based on where you choose to place the commas which separate one column from the next. do you choose to do what I've done here in this first example and place your commas at the end of each column name before beginning the next column name on the next line? I think that's a lot of people's preference and is how most people probably get started, particularly if you come from a VBA programming background where you tend to use end-of-line commas when you're passing multiple arguments to a procedure. So here we're passing multiple arguments to the message box function and adding a comma at the end of each line. I do have a couple of small potential problems with that. When you start writing commas at the end of a line, because each line is a different length, it can be a little tricky to spot whether you've added all the commas necessary at a glance, particularly when you have a very long list of column names to select. So for example, if I'd accidentally missed off that comma after release date, if I try to run that query from the menu sheet, that will fail because I don't have enough commas in the select list. I can also generate the opposite problem. If I get into the habit of typing in a column name followed by a comma, column name followed by a comma, I get into the sort of habit and the muscle memory of always putting in a comma after each column name that I write. And if I add that at the end of the last column in my select list, that can cause problems as well. If I head back to the menu sheet and I try to run that query, because I have too many commas now, that no longer works. So, one potential way to avoid those two admittedly fairly minor problems and easy to fix problems is to place your commas not at the end of each line, but at the beginning of each line instead. So I'm just going to place my commas at the beginning of each column name and take away the commas at the end. Just to make sure everything lines up neatly, I'm also going to include an extra space in front of the first column name. I could then happily take away the extra space after the select keyword there. It's fine being left where it is, the double space doesn't matter, but I just wanted to get these to line up properly. And as well as the column names and the table aliases lining up properly, I've also got my commas lining up properly as well, so it makes it a lot easier to spot if I've accidentally missed one out. The end result is still the same. If I go back to my menu sheet and run my query, I get the exact same end results as previously. So ultimately, who cares where you put your commas? I certainly don't. I tend to write start of line commas when I'm coding in SQL Server. When I'm coding in VBA, I tend to use end of line commas to separate my function arguments. I'm happy to mix and match. It really doesn't matter. But it's surprising how much it does matter to some people. If you have a quick Google for SQL, comma at start of line, just look at the number of results you return of people arguing about what's the best thing to do. There are many, many, many different opinions. People have spent an awful lot of time trying to prove that they're right. Ultimately, it does not matter. I think that's the best approach there. That's the best response. It's a matter of taste. Do whatever makes you feel happy, basically. Regardless of where you choose to place your commas ultimately, I would recommend following at least some kind of style where you break up the select statement into multiple separate parts. It just makes the whole thing a lot easier to read and maintain. If you're finding it a struggle to do that, there are some tools that can help you. I'm just going to put my query back onto one single continuous line by getting rid of all of these extra concatenation characters. Now we have a little bit of work to do to get this to work properly, but if I take that back to a single continuous select statement, I'm going to copy the entire query to the clipboard. And then I've got a website just loaded up called Poor SQL. This is just one example of a free online tool that will format your SQL for you. So it's not the only one available, there are many more, but I'm just going to paste in my horribly laid out SQL code like so. And if I click the Formatted SQL tab there, it lays out my query in a nice neat fashion with the separated out column list with commas at the beginning of lines. It's not quite lined up as neatly as I'd like, but there are many other options available here as well on the right hand side. So I don't have to put my column lists on separate lines. I can uncheck that box and everything goes back to a single line. I've got the option to choose where I place my commas, trailing or leading commas, just by checking that box. I can choose to put a space after the comma or not, probably more important if you're using leading commas, I suppose. So lots and lots of other options available there as well. So the idea then would be that I'd copy my entire query back to my back to my VB editor, and then I'd have to, of course, add in all the concatenation characters to make it work as a single continuous string, but it's a little bit better than having to do the entire thing manually. So there we go, that's the absolute basics of writing simple select statements to return data from an Excel workbook. In the next part of this series, we're going to move on and look at how we can sort our query results by bringing in the order by clause of our select statement. So hopefully you're looking forward to that one. Thanks very much for watching. See you next time.